New deadlines for schedules and courses. So in the last year, there have been some changes in requirements for our college from Central about how and when things are scheduled. And so this is going to be changing how we schedule our courses and also how we schedule our rooms. And some of these are also going to then impact processes within the college. So, for example, how quickly we have to get changes that are intended for our courses to curriculum committee to ensure that those are approved through the central registrar before we start to offer the course with that change in it. So first, in talking about room assignment, there are some of the classrooms that belong to us, if you will, and by that I mean we pay the overhead, we get to schedule them first. And there are other classrooms that do not belong to us, meaning we do not pay the overhead for those rooms, and someone else is in charge of their scheduling. They do give us first dibs on that classroom, but that means we have to have our schedule set and those rooms scheduled well ahead of time so that we know we have the rooms that we want for our students. Those that are centrally managed and that we now have to schedule well ahead of time are the two main lecture halls in the Animal Science Vet Med building, so 125 and 135, the large lecture hall up in Pomeroy, so 213 and 215, our sort of auxiliary classroom over in the veterinary science building, which is 145 Vet Sci, and two smaller classrooms, including Pomeroy 115 and Pomeroy 202, which we often use for rotations for the didactic portion of those courses. Those are managed centrally. We have to get our students scheduled into those rooms well ahead of time so we know for sure we'll be able to use those rooms for our students when we need it for our large classes. Some of the rooms that are not centrally managed and that we have more control over are 104 in the Animal Science Vet Med building, which is our active learning classroom, and our teaching laboratory spaces, including the anatomy lab, the student surgery lab, and the new student clinical skills space down in the large animal hospital. Those we have more control over, although we will still tend to try to assign things fairly early on just to make sure we know we can fit in large classes as needed. The deadlines that are now in place for us, especially for scheduling those centrally managed classrooms, are about a year ahead of time. So we need to let them know when we're going to use those rooms about January 1st for the next fall semester and about June 1st for the next spring semester. And so all of those things are now going to get set up much, much farther ahead of time than we have had to worry about it historically. Another thing to worry about is course management, and this is based on the central registrar, the office of the registrar, which manages all of our courses and the students' transcripts. In the past, we used to have great autonomy, that we could make changes and submit things to the registrar even while a course was in session, and they would just agree with whatever we were taking. But now that is no longer true. They need to have time for an approval process, and that means we need to get to them much earlier any changes we want to make in a course that are substantive, including increased time spent in a course, increased credit hours spent in a course, things like that. Rotations are also a little bit different in their management. Those, again, we have control over from the standpoint that we decide when we're offering them, how frequently, how many times a year, things of that nature. But because of the enormous lead time in students preparing for rotations, we will be asked as course coordinators for rotations 1 or 2 years ahead of time when we are going to be giving rotations in the future. So for example, I am making this teaching tip in July of 2024, and I have already been asked what I intend for the 25-26 academic year for a rotation that I offer. They have to be given a far enough lead time in our academic and student affairs office to build it into the rotation assignment tool so that the students can put in what rotations they want, and that tool will generate for them what their schedule is going to look like. So again, very, very far ahead of time, we need to let them know what's happening with rotations. The students start thinking about rotations as they end their second year. They put into that tool what rotations they want in fall of their third year. Then that is run through the cycle to make sure everybody can get what they want. The members of Academic and Student Affairs double check that the students are meeting all of their requirements. There's a lot of give and take such that the students generally have their schedules for fourth year by fall of third year, and that's necessary for them to schedule things like travel, things of that nature. So once the grid is established for the students, it's very difficult for us to change the rotations that are offered. If you decide to add a new rotation, you're just not likely to have many takers because a lot of the students are already scheduled and they don't want to move anything. On the other hand, if you have to remove an offering, that can be very problematic because then suddenly we have students with no place to go. So it's really important when you're in charge of rotations to be thinking that 1 or 2 years out whenever possible, recognizing that emergencies will happen and Academic and Student Affairs will get us through that. If we have to change a schedule, we have to change a schedule. But as much as possible, we need to be thinking 1 or 2 years out because it's really impacting a lot of things. What spaces are you going to use for that teaching? Where are those students going to end up in that very tightly scheduled grid that they have in fourth year? Another thing that we need to be thinking about is our cooperative program with South Dakota State University. We are trying to keep our curricula aligned with each other, or what they call harmonized with each other, meaning any changes that are made have to be considered by SDSU and how they'll implement them. And unlike for us, where it just gets approved through the Office of the Registrar, their curriculum changes have to be approved through their Board of Regents. And so there's this enormous amount of time required for them to be able to make those changes too, such that when we think we want to make a change in a course, that may not actually happen in the course for a year or more out. So the big take-home message is for all of us, just making sure we're all aware of these new requirements for all of us. The schedules and room assignments for courses in the first 3 years of the curriculum must be reviewed and finalized by January 1st for fall semester and June 1st for spring semester. We are all going to have to plan much farther ahead than we used to for what's going to happen in our courses and where we're going to hold those courses. Second, rotation coordinators will receive a request from Academic and Student Affairs a good 1 or 2 years before we're going to offer a rotation, so they know how many students we're going to take and how many times we're going to offer that rotation. And once the grids are set for a given student year, very difficult for us to add or remove rotations except in emergency circumstances. And then anytime you're sending a request to the curriculum committee for substantive change in a course, which is adding or subtracting contact hours, changing the credits, changing the grading format, anything like that, that has to happen about a year ahead of time. So by about October 15th for courses that are going to be held the next fall, and by about March 15th for courses to be held the next spring, because that's the amount of lead time we need to get through things through the Office of the Registrar. If you have specific questions about any of these changes, the staff and faculty in Academic and Student Affairs are always ready to help you, or you can contact the CVM Education Support Group at cvmces@umn.edu, and they'll direct your questions as appropriate.